Hello everybody. Today we're going to do social contract theory and the principle of double effect. Really we're starting with the principle of double effect to get it out of the way. You will find that once you've learned all the moral theories and ethical rules, you're going to run into situations where you can't reconcile what to do next because the theories contradict each other. This happens in laws quite frequently. And this is why people tend to go to court. One law says one thing, another law contradicts it, and you have to figure out which one overrules the other. In a moral situation, the way you get around this is the principle of double effect. Everybody repeat after me. Per the National Society of Professional Engineers, engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as the faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. Alright, so the principle of double effect. So, the principle of double effect requires these things to be true. An act with a good and bad consequence is justified if and only if the act itself is either morally good or indifferent. The good effect is intended. The bad effect must not be intended. The bad effect may be foreseeable. That is to say, you know that will be the outcome. The bad effect must not be used to bring about the good effect. The good effect is proportionally better than the bad effect. All right. If you see IFF in a legal document, it means if and only if.
Imagine you're watching a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks, straight towards 5 workers who can't escape. You happen to be standing next to a switch that will divert the trolley onto a second track. Here's the problem. That track has a worker on it too, but just one. What do you do? Do you sacrifice one person to save 5? This is the trolley problem, a version of an ethical dilemma that philosopher Philippa Foot devised in 1967. It's popular because it forces us to think about how to choose when there are no good choices. Do we pick the action with the best outcome, or stick to a moral code that prohibits causing someone's death? In one survey, about 90% of respondents said that it's okay to flip the switch, letting one worker die to save 5. And other studies, including a virtual reality simulation of the dilemma, have found similar results. These judgments are consistent with the philosophical principle of utilitarianism, which argues that the morally correct decision is the one that maximizes well-being for the greatest number of people. The 5 lives outweigh 1, even if achieving that outcome requires condemning someone to death. But people don't always take the utilitarian view, which we can see by changing the trolley problem a bit. This time, you're standing on a bridge over the track as the runaway trolley approaches. Now there's no second track, but there is a very large man on the bridge next to you. If you push him over, his body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 workers, but he'll die. To utilitarians, the decision is exactly the same. Lose 1 life to save 5. But in this case, only about 10% of people say that it's okay to throw the man onto the tracks. Our instincts tell us that deliberately causing someone's death is different than allowing them to die as collateral damage. It just feels wrong, for reasons that are hard to explain. This intersection between ethics and psychology is what's so interesting about the trolley problem. The dilemma and its many variations reveal that what we think is right or wrong depends on factors other than a logical weighing of the pros and cons. For example, men are more likely than women to say it's okay to push the man over the bridge. So are people who watch a comedy clip before doing the thought experiment. And in one virtual reality study, people were more willing to sacrifice men than women. Researchers have studied the brain activity of people thinking through the classic and bridge versions. Both scenarios activate areas of the brain involved in conscious decision-making and emotional responses. But in the bridge version, the emotional response is much stronger. So is activity in an area of the brain associated with processing internal conflict. Why the difference? One explanation is that pushing someone to their death feels more personal, activating an emotional aversion to killing another person. But we feel conflicted because we know it's still the logical choice. Trolleyology has been criticized by some philosophers and psychologists. They argue that it doesn't reveal anything because its premise is so unrealistic that study participants don't take it seriously. But new technology is making this kind of ethical analysis more important than ever. For example, driverless cars may have to handle choices like causing a small accident to prevent a larger one. Meanwhile, governments are researching autonomous military drones that could wind up making decisions of whether they'll risk civilian casualties to attack a high-value target. If we want these actions to be ethical, we have to decide in advance how to value human life and judge the greater good. So researchers who study autonomous systems are collaborating with philosophers to address the complex problem of programming ethics into machines. Which goes to show that even hypothetical dilemmas can wind up on a collision course with the real world.
Alright, I need to apologize if the audio on that part of the video wasn't so great. But these are a handful of instances where the principle of double effect might come into play. The first one is terror bombing versus tactical bombing. So in the case of terror bombing, the intent is to kill civilians, and generally speaking, that's considered bad. The reason they would be killing civilians is they have some end goal that gets rewarded by doing it, whereas tactical bombing tends to be targeting combatants, people who are looking to fight. And in that instance, those killings might be justified, might be considered good, but in the event that civilian deaths were caused by it, it would still be considered good because the civilian deaths weren't the actual intent. It was the intent was to kill the combatants. Another example would be euthanasia. So, from time to time, doctors need to give their medicine to patients that relieves pain. If a doctor were to intentionally overdose a patient to the point that they passed away, that would be considered unacceptable. However, if the doctor gave the same amount of medicine thinking with the intent that this would just relieve pain and not kill the patient, even if it did accidentally kill the patient, it wouldn't be considered immoral. The next is a doctor who believes that abortion was wrong, even in order to save the mother's life, might nevertheless consistently believe that it would be permissible to perform hysterectomy on a pregnant woman with cancer. In carrying out the hysterectomy, the doctor would aim to save the woman's life while merely foreseeing the death of the fetus. Performing an abortion, by contrast, would involve intending to kill a fetus as a means to save the mother's life. The next is preemptive versus defensive attacks. So, in this case, if you know someone's planning to hurt you, and so you preemptively attack them, especially if you happen to kill them, that's not permissible. You know the outcome. The good outcome here is that person dies for you. That's not allowed. However, if you let them attack you and you defend yourself and you happen to kill them, that's not considered bad because it's just self-defense. The next option is the trolley option. I'm not really going to go into that because I think the video just explained that pretty well. But the last is self-sacrifice versus suicide. So generally speaking, suicide's bad, but if you take an action to save others, knowing that action's going to get you killed, so that could be a soldier jumping on a grenade, that could be a fireman running into a burning building. They know the risks that they're taking running in, but their goal isn't to die. Their goal is to save others. However, in contrast, if you run into the burning building with the intent of that building falling down on you, that's impermissible. Now, there's a lot of objections to this theory, and for good reason. All of the things I just mentioned are probably controversial. I'd be willing to bet the majority of people in the room at least have a problem with one of the bullets I mentioned. And the reason for that, what's considered good and what's considered bad, is very subjective. A lot of people define good as good for them, even if they know what's going on is morally wrong. It's good for them, so why do they care? And because of this, it can be used to justify wicked acts relatively easily. In many cases, it just doesn't apply. So this is a good theory to use when you have two conflicting theories. However, when it does apply, be prepared to argue. Be prepared for the other person in the room to not agree with you, and be prepared to justify your decision. And so that's why you should be choosy when you decide to use the principle of double effect. Now, I'm going to give you another video. Now, this one, I need to be clear. What you should be taking away from this video is not this woman's point of view. What you should be taking away from this video is how she applies the principle of double effect. She is defending the point of view of a conservative doctor. If you do not want to watch this video, you are welcome to skip it during class. I'm going to allow you to walk out if you want to. I'll come get you after the video's done. But I need to be clear, the important thing here is just how she uses the principle of double effect. That's the piece of information you should be absorbing.
Two principles that assist us in discovering the goodness or badness of human actions. The first of these principles is the principle of double effect. In cases in which we foresee the possibility or the inevitability of both a good and a bad consequence of a given action, the principle of double effect assists us in determining whether or not one's action is morally justifiable. The principle of double effect involves 5 criteria. The first criteria is that there is no easy alternative in the true dilemma. First, appealing to the principle of double effect is justified only if there is no alternative to the action at issue. This principle can be applied only in a genuine dilemma. The second criteria is that we have to choose the good. The action at issue must be good in its object, or at least neutral. Here, one is considering the object of the action, the first of the 3 sources in determining a moral action. The third is that we cannot intend to do evil. The possible or inevitable evil consequence must not be intended. Here, one is considering the intention. The person in a moral dilemma would prefer that there be no risk of evil at all, but can do nothing about the fact that such a risk, or even worse, the inevitability of evil, does exist. The fourth criteria is that the good outcome cannot be a consequence of the evil outcome. We cannot choose evil so that good will result. We cannot choose robbing a bank in order to pursue the final goal of giving money to the poor. In other words, the end does not justify the means. Here, one is considering the circumstances of the action. The fifth criteria is proportionality. The good consequence must be proportionate to the evil consequence. Here, one is considering the relationship between the consequences themselves. Let's take a look at the 5 criteria in the principle of double effect in action. Take the case of an ectopic pregnancy. In this situation, a mother has ovulated and the egg has been fertilized, creating a new human life. However, the new embryo did not implant in the uterine lining as it is meant to. Rather, the embryo has implanted outside of the uterus in the fallopian tube. This causes a serious problem for both the life of the baby and the life of the mother. For the baby, this will tragically lead to death. Without the proper nutrients to sustain life, which are available within the uterus, the child cannot thrive. The fallopian tube is not designed to provide for the baby, and it is also not large enough to contain the developing child's body. This leads to the mortal danger for the mother. Should the child continue to grow in the fallopian tube, it will eventually burst. This will cause a serious hemorrhage for the mother that is often life-threatening. Let's consider criteria 1, a true dilemma. Is this a true dilemma? The answer is, of course, yes. The second criteria, choosing the good. The object is to save as many lives as possible. In this case, sadly, the child's life cannot be saved. However, the mother's life may be saved. We are choosing to save the mother's life. In doing so, we are sadly accepting, not choosing, but tolerating the death of the human embryo. Remember that I said this was a dilemma. The third criteria is refusing to do the evil. This requires us to consider how the mother's life is to be saved in such an instance. We will give one example that does not fulfill that requirement, and one example that does. One method of saving the mother's life in such a case is a saline injection. This would be injected into the fallopian tube, into the growing embryo itself, and would cause the embryo to die and dissolve. This would spare the mother's life and protect her fallopian tube from bursting. You will hopefully notice that in this case there is an evil outcome that is directly caused. While one may argue that the intention is still to save the mother's life, which is a good intention, this is still the direct killing of the child. The alternative option is to remove part of the fallopian tube itself. In this instance, once again, the mother's life is spared. Also in this instance, the child dies. However, this is considered a natural death for the child, as the death was not brought about on purpose but by the unfortunate natural circumstances of implanting in the fallopian tube. The doctor does not remove the child from necessary nutrients or an environment where the child can thrive, because those things have already been denied the child who is not developing in the uterus. The doctor does remove the possibility of a serious hemorrhage from the mother by removing a section of the fallopian tube. The fourth criteria, the good outcome must not be a consequence of the evil outcome. In this case, the evil consequence that is not intended is the death of the child. Did we kill the baby to save the mother? In the second instance, the child's death is a tragic, natural consequence of the mother's life being saved, but is not the direct means of saving that life. The fifth criteria, proportionality. The fifth criteria would ask whether the removal of the fallopian tube is justified for the saving of the life of the mother. The answer to that question is yes. While the surgery may lead to the mother being less fertile in the future, it should not render her infertile. Even in the case of infertility, the value of the mother's life is greater than her fertility. There are a number of caveats to this situation. as is to be expected with nearly all moral dilemmas. Every ectopic pregnancy is different. Some do not occur in the fallopian tube, but rather in the cervix or another location outside of the uterus.
All right, so now we're moving on to social contract theory. So last class we went over the Engineering Code of Ethics, which is a series of rules that you're supposed to follow as an engineer. The social contract theory, on the other hand, is a broader set of rules that you need to follow. It started with this concept of the state of nature. This is a theoretical construct. This is what a handful of theologians and philosophers used a long time ago to describe how the world would be if there was no government or religion. And depending on who you talk to and their background, they gave very different interpretations of how life would be. Generally speaking, it is described as anarchy. Thomas Hobbes, who the cartoon character was named after, described it as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In another way, he's describing it as chaotic and scary and not an easy place to live. While John Locke had a more open idea, thinking that this state would be free and equal, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a similar idea that it would be peaceful and friendly. Whether that's actually the case or not is questionable. So I need to tell a story about the closest thing to anarchy I have dealt with, and that was during COVID. Now, during times of scarcity, people panic. If you remember clearly, during COVID, there was a period of time where we ran out of food and water. And when people run out of those things, they also start stocking up on things like weapons and medicine. If you can remember, hand sanitizer and face masks disappeared almost overnight. People try to ensure their own survival, they ignore morals, ethics, and social norms, and you really just can't trust each other. At the onset of the pandemic, I encountered a startling reality that challenged my usual perception. Now, every Monday, my son and I had this routine where we'd go to the grocery store, and we'd get groceries for the week, and we'd get 5 servings of everything. So 5 servings of vegetables, 5 servings of fruit, 5 servings of meat. This routine was disrupted when we faced the empty shelves, and this seemed like a scene from Mad Max to me. The produce section was gone. It was barren. The meat aisle, the butcher station, the deli counter, the seafood area, everything gone. Then I went to the dry goods section where they would have canned tuna and chicken and beans, or the dried goods where they would have dry beans where you have to at least soak them. Gone. Everything's gone. Now, my son, he wasn't really able to talk at this time. He definitely couldn't walk. He could walk, but he couldn't talk. And he knew something was up, and he was giving me like the nervous eyes, like, should we leave? He was clearly uncomfortable. Like, I could probably tell that he didn't want to be there. Normally, he loved going to the grocery store. And I tried to reassure him that everything was fine. I was there with him. Everything was going to be okay. But I was really nervous. I'm his dad. I'm supposed to make sure he gets to eat every day. That is an instinctual priority of mine. And I couldn't promise it that day. And I started thinking, like, do I take the risk? Do I reach into somebody else's basket and take their stuff so that way I can feed Teddy? And I ultimately didn't, and I need to be clear, the reason I didn't wasn't because I was going to take the moral high ground. It was the fear of being caught. Now, I ultimately chose not to do the wrong thing, but as I was going through the aisles, I thought I saw something that would serve as a solution, at least temporarily. I started finding food that had meat in them, so in this case it was tomato sauce with meatballs in it already. Now, I need to be clear, when I go to the grocery store with my son, when I go to the grocery store with my daughter, people tend to give us wide berth, and this is normal. You don't know what kids are going to do, and if there's a small child in a cart, the chances that somebody's going to move my cart on me is very small. When I'm at the grocery store and somebody's abandoned their cart, yeah, I'll move it, and I've seen people move mine, and I don't really think anything of it. But if my kids are in it, it's a different discussion. People will come find me and ask me to move it. Now, this is just kind of a civility thing. Nobody wants to upset a child. However, on this day, that wasn't the case. So I was reaching for food. Now, as you do with kids and carts, you'll park the cart and then you will go get the thing you need. And because this day was particularly busy, there wasn't really a lot of parking spots for the cart. So my son was about halfway down the aisle, and the thing I was getting was actually towards the front. So I parked him and I went and got it. While I was doing this, and keep in mind, I'm doing my best to stay in my son's line of sight, I suddenly see somebody hit my cart with their cart. And this isn't like a gentle, let's push the cart out of the way thing so I can get my stuff. He was taking his anger out on my cart, which 9 times out of 10, I don't care. It's a metal cart with wheels on it that the grocery store owns. It's not mine. I don't really care. But in this instance, my son was in it. So my immediate reaction was to walk over and ask this man, are you doing all right? Is everything okay? And usually when someone is interacting with my children, and I've done this, their reaction is to stop what they're doing. Now, normally people don't do something like this, but if they're talking to my child and I say, hey, can I help you? If my child has caused a problem, that's when they let me take care of it, or they explain it to me and they wander off. Not this man. I was expecting a typical, like, hey, I'm trying to get to the other side of your cart. Sorry for hitting your cart. Didn't see your son in there. Nope, didn't get any of that. I gotta go fuck yourself. Get out of the way. Citing his urgent need to get the item that was blocked by my cart. Now, at this point, my tensions were pretty high. Like, I was having a lot of anxiety just being in the store, and now I'm getting yelled at. And so my protective instinct was kicking in. Like, this person's actually endangering my child in a grocery store in front of a ton of people. And I remember, normally when I'm in public, I'm pretty mild-mannered. I have a quiet voice. In this instance, I immediately raised my voice. I became firm and authoritative. I don't remember exactly what I said, but it was something to the effect of stop or move, and I physically got in between him and my son. And at this point, I did not care about the food anymore. The food inconvenience, the fact that there wasn't any, wasn't really what I was caring about. It was, this nut might take his anxiety out on my son. And so at this point, it was as if the entire grocery store descended on us. Now, I don't think, I honestly don't know if this man decided to behave because he realized what he was doing, I scared him, or the entire grocery store was staring at him. But I had seen this man many times in the grocery store on Mondays as well. We never had any interaction, and this is the only interaction we've ever had. But there was no, I'm sorry, or anything like that. But this is an actual example of the state of nature that Hobbes described. There was a scarcity, and this led to a breakdown of social norms, and it induced primal fear in everyone. at this point, I just left the store with my son. I abandoned the cart because it was like, what are you going to do if people are going to act this crazy just at the grocery store? Now, this is the formal definition of social contract theory. So a social contract is an agreement, either implicit or explicit, governing the behavior of individuals or organizations within a certain context, such as a workplace, a culture, a nation, or a society media site, or social media site, sorry. So when I say explicit, I mean it has been written down, or it's been said verbally and recorded, and you can verify it somehow. Implicit, that tends to be non-observable, non-verifiable information. This tends to be like the social norms. The reason you want to hang on to some of these contracts is it does bring together a mutual agreement and establishes a set of rules that everybody can follow, and you won't have to discuss every agreement every time. You just know what the rules are walking in. This helps you establish laws and institutions. And by having these, you have some social cooperation. When you go into the grocery store, you don't have to haggle for the price of food every time. You know what the price is because it's written on the food. You know how to pay for it. That's really easy. If you had to haggle and discuss all this all of the time, you would never get anything done, and it would take forever. All right, so we just talked about the theory, so let's go into more applications that are more engineering-centric, that make sense for you guys to actually care about. So starting at the bottom, the first one would be, say, for rapid construction of an emergency shelter after a natural disaster. Engineers engage in humanitarian efforts, providing immediate relief and rebuilding infrastructure, exemplifying the social contracts, emphasis on responding to human needs and social welfare. The next would be data privacy and cybersecurity. So this might be like a case of developing secure data encryption methods to protect user information. So there is an expectation, both explicit and implicit, that you have a right to privacy. Yes, there is some expectation that you have to do some work to protect your privacy, but engineers, when they design phones or websites or computers, there is a stroke where they have to make sure that their design actually complies with the privacy rules. And some of those privacy rules are written and some of them are not. The next would be, so moving up the list, medical devices and engineering. So this would be like designing and testing a life-saving medical device like a pacemaker. So there are extra requirements for biomedical devices and drugs that other products simply don't have to deal with. And that's because organizations like the FDA exist. These institutions add extra layers of protection for people. To get something approved, you don't just have to get the public to like it. You also need the FDA to say, that works, that's safe, you can sell that. And so you have to demonstrate that that product is healthy for people and is safe for people to use. Moving up the list, the next would be automotive safety. It's a similar situation where there is an expectation that the car is safe. This is both implicit. The expectation that you would intentionally sell something dangerous it's just not there. The expectation is that everything you sell is safe. And if it's not safe, you're going to train people to use it in such a way that it is safe. However, because people from time to time have ignored this rule, now there's a lot of laws around cars. Everyone here needed to get a license to drive, but now to sell cars, you also have to go through a handful of organizations like the DOT, to get cars sold. You can't just make a car. You actually have to get permission to sell that car. The next is environmental engineering sustainability. So this would be like if you wanted to develop energy solutions with wind farms and solar panels. So the EPA has a handful of environmental requirements. You're not allowed to emit so much CO2, and if you do, you have to justify it. You're not allowed to damage the soil when you build something, things like that. And everybody seems to agree on these. But the Department of Energy comes at it from another angle of, we know the average American consumes this amount of power every year. We know that there's going to be this number of people next year. So the energy grid needs to be able to support that. So now you have two different regulating bodies that are effectively fighting each other. And yes, it would be nice if you could build solar panels and wind farms in large enough quantities to satisfy the needs, but as of today, not quite economical. Not to say it's a bad idea or anything like that, but at the end of the day, you still need to make sure everybody has enough electricity, which leads to everybody having enough food. And you have to find a way to make that happen. And the last is infrastructure and development. Now, this one's a bit, I don't want to say hokey, but you have to remember why people build bridges. So yes, you have to go through the DOT and get their permission to build the bridge. But usually what happens is the state or the town will say, we need a bridge at this location because there's commerce going across the bridge or going from this point to that point, and it would be really convenient if we had a bridge here. And so you have all these needs of the people that are being vocalized somehow, but at the same time, you have the safety requirements imposed by ASME. You have the transportation requirements set by the DOT. You're building to a set of requirements that's institutionally controlled that you have to meet. As an engineer, you can relate to the idea of being governed in a broader sense. While you may not have a direct say in the formation of government, you do operate with the bounds of certain governing principles, such as the laws of physics. These laws are universal and immutable. And as an engineer, you're essentially agreed to work within these constraints, whether you like it or not. Furthermore, your expertise in physics means that when you engage in activities like approving, designing, or building, you ensure that the resulting products or systems adhere to the laws of physics. This alignment with scientific principles ensures that your creations won't break any natural laws. In your professional journey, you may also choose to join societies or organizations like ASME, ISO, ISPE, API, and others. These societies have established documented rules and standards that you are expected to follow. Your decision to adhere to these rules is akin to a form of consent. By joining these societies, you acknowledge and agree to abide by the established standards and regulations, contributing to the overall governance of your profession, and ensuring that your work meets recognized industry standards. In essence, the idea of consent of the governed extends beyond politics and into various aspects of your life, including our professional responsibility as engineers. It underscores the importance of accepting and adhering to governing principles and rules, whether they be the laws of physics or the standards set by professional organizations to ensure the smooth functioning and ethical conduct within our respective domains. So in this case, there's three real types of contracts you're going to deal with as an engineer and in your personal and professional life. The first is the explicit contracts. These are what you understand as contracts. Then there's the original contracts. These tend to be social laws, or actual laws rather. And the last is unwritten contracts. These are social norms. It's ways you're just kind of expected to behave without anybody forcing you to. In this case, original contracts are analogous to physical laws. You didn't agree to gravity, but you accept that gravity is the law you have to follow. Engineers accept and work within these laws without explicit agreement. Unwritten contracts, on the other hand, are analogous to industry standard. So you are going to hear this term a lot when you get hired. Industry standard. This is another way of saying you should typically expect thing X to happen because it's an industry standard. Now, if it's an actual standard, it will be written in ASME or ISO or API or ISPE, or the list goes on. Whatever your regulating standard for your industry is, you're going to need to know it. However, there's a lot of gray area in your work, and that's not going to be rigidly defined, but there is a certain thing you're kind of expected to know. So like one thing is, it's industry standard for a company to fly you to them if you want to have an interview with them. They don't have to do that. It's just industry standard. And if they don't do it, they need a good reason for not doing it. But there is no law requiring them to do it. Now, people do take issue with this, especially anything that they haven't personally consented to. They feel that they're being forced to follow rules that they haven't technically agreed to. Now, a contractarian would say, rights imply obligations, so when you take from the common pot by enjoying the goods that the system provides, you're also expected to pay in. And this philosophy only works if and only if everyone follows it. So think of speed limits, taxes, jury duty, laws, and other regulations. I feel I should be able to do whatever speed I want to do on my way here to work. However, I know I don't want a handful of other people doing that speed in their car on their way to URI because they don't have as nice a car as I do, and they don't drive as well as I do, and they don't know the ins and outs of the road based off of the weather, but I do. However, if I insist on doing that speed, they will also insist on doing that speed. One good example of this is on Stony Fort Road. This is the back road into URI. I know on a certain section of that road, if it is below 39 degrees, or if it is wet, or if it's both, there's a certain section of that road that you will slip off of. I know when to slow down, and the rest of the road, as long as you're going straight, is safe. But the thing is, I've also watched people get nailed there who were following the rules because some guy from New Jersey decided he wanted to do 45 on that section of road while it was raining. Had he been following the speed limit, he wouldn't have nailed the guy in front of me. And so, to a certain extent, you do want the other people to follow the rules, and they won't do it unless you do it too. Further, if your house were to catch on fire, you would want people to show up to put the fire out. But people don't do things like that for free. They don't risk their lives for free. You have to pay them. Well, who's going to pay them? The state does. But how does the state get the money to pay them? Taxes. So we're going to quickly talk about the prisoner's dilemma, because this is an instance where if you communicated early and you agreed on a set of rules early, you'll end up in a better position. But if you don't talk to the people around you, you don't agree on something ahead of time, you end up in the worst position. So if you're unfamiliar with the prisoner dilemma, imagine that you get arrested, and you know that the arrest charges that have been filed against you are bogus, and they arrest another random person, and you know the charges against them are also bogus. But the police officer gives you two options. You can either confess or remain silent, and you have no idea what the other person's going to do. do you also confess or do you remain silent? So this is the set of possibilities that could happen. So if you both confess, you both get 5 years. If you remain silent but they confess, you go to jail for 10 years but they get out free for 0. If they remain silent but you confess, you get out for free. And if you both stay silent, you both go for 2 years. So what do you do? So the typical answer in this case is everybody confesses. But if you are allowed to communicate ahead of time, there's a chance you'll both remain silent. Or if you're particularly selfish, you'll confess. Now, this is the reality that people live in. The first option, where both of you confess, you're both being selfish. The second option is where you both are altruistic and you stay silent. And then there's a mix of the two. Now, what would actually happen is hard to say. I honestly believe we're in the scenario where everyone's selfish. Yeah, I'm sure there's some people who are altruistic and helpful, and I do try to be helpful, but at the end of the day, I'm selfish. Now, one thing you'll find is if you exist at the very bottom, you are altruistic, but everybody around you is selfish. It's really easy to convince you over time to also become selfish. If you exist at the top, that is, you are very selfish, but everyone around you is altruistic. If they make an effort, they could convince you to also be altruistic. Now, in a professional setting, there is an expectation of moral conduct and there are exceptions. So in a professional setting, when you're interviewing or before you enter a contract of any kind, you need to ask, what are we expected from each other so we both benefit from this relationship? And I need to be honest, you shouldn't enter any relationship unless you both benefit. If you go into a relationship knowing you're going to be a parasitic partner, shame on you, you know better, don't do it. If you know you're going into a situation where the other person's parasitic, you should also walk away. Then you need to define why the relationship is beneficial for everyone involved. You need to determine what's going to happen if one of the parties isn't happy. And make it clear what your limits are. This one tends to be frustrating. You should honestly be holding your employer to the contract they give to you. It's stressful to do this. It's hard to do this, but you need to do this. Now, if you're in a situation where your contract isn't being followed, your boss is making you work 60 hours a week when your contract clearly defines 40, or you're not being allowed to take your vacation time, or you're in a hostile work environment, but you're not being paid to be in a hostile work environment, you're not being compensated right, whatever it is, you're allowed to leave. And you need to be clear that that contract is just not working out for you. Now, in a work environment, it's written. You have a written contract. You've agreed to this. And you being at the company should be making everybody's life better. And if it's not, you should leave. And your life should be getting better by being at the company. And if it's not, you should leave. And if you find that even though you're following the rules, what you're supposed to be getting out of the relationship just isn't there, you're not going to want to stay. Your relationship's going to weaken over time, and you're going to want to defect. And if you're in a fair and professional environment, if you go to your boss and say, hey, look, this is what the contract said, this is what's supposed to be happening, this is what's actually happening, I'm not really getting anything out of this relationship, I want to move on, that peaceful, this is a form of peaceful protest, and this should be accepted and acknowledged and appreciated. However, if you're in a toxic work environment, it won't be.